So the story we hear this morning, it's real susceptible to just gloss that over. Because the miracle stories of Jesus sometimes test us, because taken at face value, they sort of stretch our belief systems. I mean, is it necessary to believe that Jesus walked on water? And is it necessary to believe that Jesus fed 5,000 from 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes? Why do we keep telling these improbable stories? The story about Jesus feeding the 5,000 stands out in the Gospels. The Gospel writers thought that it was very, very important because it is the only parable that is mentioned in all 4 Gospels. This is important because the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, share so much with one another that we hear them everywhere. But John hardly shares anything with the Synoptic Gospels, but it shares this story. On top of that, Matthew and Mark tell the story twice in their gospel stories. So in 4 Gospels, 4 books, we hear this story 6 times. So obviously there's something there. There's something there that we need to glean and look deeply into. And so I'd like to dig in, if you will, and discover why the Gospels writers thought this story was so important. To begin with, it's more than a miracle story. In the writer's hands, this miracle becomes a parable. And the feeding of the 5,000 is a parable about what we are called to do and who we are called to be. For if we are going to be followers of Jesus, at some point, Jesus is going to look at us and tell us, you give them something to eat. And our response matters. What we do, what we say matters. The more you begin to imagine the world of this story, try to go back to the 1st century, you see that it's not about magic. It's about how we see the world and what we do with what we already have. For the magic has really already happened. God has already given us the world, created the world out of nothing. Already provided the sun and the earth, the water and the seeds. I mean, how much more magic do we need? God provides us something out of nothing. That is the story of creation. It is the way God provides manna for his people in the wilderness. And yet the similarities there's also a little twist, a little difference. Because here at this story, Jesus does not make something out of nothing. No, Jesus takes what God has already provided, what is already there, and makes something out of that. Now, John alters one important detail of the story. In the other Gospels, it is the disciples who ask, "Where are we to buy bread?" But here, Jesus asks, at the beginning of the parable, "Where are we to buy bread?" I think the difference and the reason for that is Jesus is trying to open up the disciples' box that they've set around themselves. He's trying to get them to look at things a little differently. Where are we going to buy bread? How are we going to provide? The disciples see the feeding of the 5,000 as an impossibility. Andrew points out that all they can find is 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. Then Jesus gives them something to see it a little differently, hopefully, with new eyes. The disciples are coming from a place of fear, of scarcity. There will never be enough. 6 months' wages couldn't feed all these people, is what we hear the disciples say. And what Jesus shows us is that whatever we have, whatever God has already given us, is always enough. God's abundance is always there. We just have to be able to see it. If we look at it in the right way, if we decide to share what we have, if we let go of our fear and stop holding on to what is ours so tightly, if we can do those things, we will have enough bread to feed the whole world. And this is envisioned in Jesus' eyes because he sees that crowd before him on the lakeshore and doesn't see an impossibility, doesn't see a challenge. He sees an invitation to a party. That's what I think Jesus sees. A picnic with everyone spread out on the grass, enjoying the sunset and enjoying the cool breeze from the lake. And that's how Jesus wants us to see the world. 5,000 people on a lake shore isn't a problem. It's a party. Whatever we brought with us is what we have to share. And there's plenty for everyone. And as we know in the story, there is more left over. This is a pretty compelling picture, I think, of what the kingdom of God is to look like. How about we look at the feeding of the 5,000 as the first supper? Jesus sat down and broke bread with his friends many times over in the course of the Gospels. Not just that last night in the upper room. It's important to remember that the Last Supper is not the only Eucharistic feast in the Gospels. For every time Jesus broke bread with his friends, it was a Thanksgiving meal. And that's what Eucharist means, thanksgiving. And Jesus follows the same pattern every time he breaks bread. Here's how Mark records the scene. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Take, bless, break, give. Those are the actions of the Eucharistic feast. Jesus wants us to take what we have, whatever it is, what's already there, and bless it. Give it to God. Then break it open. Divide it up and give it away joyfully. Jesus does this with bread, like I said, every time he breaks it with his friends in the Gospels. And what does he also do? He does the exact same thing with his life. He lives it for God, he breaks it open, and then he gives it to us. And that's what Jesus wants us to do with our lives as well. You give them something to eat, Jesus tells us. It's not simply enough to pray that God will change things, that the hungry will be fed and the naked will be clothed. God needs us to actively participate in this Eucharistic action. God is calling us to take our lives, to bless them, for us to be broken open, and then give that away in the service to others. Now I know that breaking open is difficult. It is a challenge, but you cannot be a follower of Jesus without the risk of being broken. Serving a meal to a homeless person or taking communion to someone who is dying of cancer. Most of the time, those things are going to break your heart. And often it seems like it would be easier to stay safe at home and not have to face that reality. But we don't have that option as followers of Jesus. For we are all called to give them something to eat. Take, bless, break, give. No matter how hard or impossible that seems, the end result is worth it. For everyone ate until they were satisfied. And when they gathered up what was left over, there was enough to feed the multitude over again. That vision is possible here, right now. We already have what we need right here in our midst. The kingdom is waiting to be born. The question is, will we join in?